we need peace through strength. The fact that Russia is aggressive, antagonistic, and expansionistic should not be news to anybody. And the signals are very clear.
James Appathurai, welcome to Times Radio. James, it's great to have you with us. If I might, I'd love to take just a broad view on where you think we are at the moment in terms of the world order. I was speaking to a Russia expert, a pretty astute commentator, Edward Lucas, last night on my show. And he, in his opinion, we're in a completely new era. The old world order we've all grown up with, he said, is melting like a snowball in front of our eyes. Would you agree?
Well, Ed's good with words, and I don't want to necessarily use the same analogies, but I think everybody can see we are in a period of very fundamental change from what most of us grew up with. I mean, if you take a longer view, an expansionist Russia in Europe is something that Europe has lived with since 1550. And, a strong China is something that Asia has lived with for 1,000 years. Our lifetimes has been one during which Russia, for a certain period, was weak and therefore unable to expand, and where China went through a very difficult period. So in a sense, we're kind of coming back to what have been enduring realities of the international security environment, and they're back, and we need to adjust to them. And ensure our security here in the UK and in the West.
Do you think we'll look back at this period and say this was the moment it changed, whether it's for a long period or a short one? There are naturally shifts in time, aren't there? Especially when you think about defence, world order, threats throughout the world. This will be a definitive period.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know where it started. I was at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, and most people haven't been to that conference. It's where sort of security nerds gather, but also the political leaders come. And, there's so many speeches and you don't always listen to them, 100%, even if you're an official like me. But President Putin was there and he gave a speech which became infamous. And as I was listening to it, I realized then, I don't always realize when things are happening in real time, but then I realized, like everybody else, that the curtain was being opened by the Kremlin about what they really intended. And that was to reestablish Russian power and hegemony over what they call their historically lost lands, which if you're in the Baltic states or Poland or other parts of Europe, you don't consider to be historically lost lands. And I would certainly include Ukraine in that. So that for me was a moment when I actually felt that the ground was shifting. Then to see China get very strong, very quickly, and kind of rise back up to its normal historical share of the global economy, but also to invest so heavily in its military. Over these past years, yes, I do feel like, the happy time after the end of the Cold War has ended, wherever you want to draw that line.
Yeah, I mean, look, 2007, nearly 20 years ago. Do you think we've sleptwalked into this rather? We've spent too long living off our peace dividend. And I would include the UK and other European nations, perhaps not those Baltic states, not Poland, who would have been well aware of the threat of Russia before many. Have we been remiss in gearing into action, in understanding this new period?
I mean, I'll give you my answer, and the answer is, of course, yes. And it's easy to say in hindsight, but it's not just hindsight. Many of us have been saying for years and years, frankly, every American president has been saying for decades, that this was a temporary period, that stability is not a given, that the long history of Europe has been of war, with a very short period where, for very unique historical reasons, we had peace. But we need peace through strength. The fact that Russia is aggressive, antagonistic, and expansionistic should not be news to anybody. And the signals are very clear. We just didn't take them.
I wonder why we didn't listen.
Yeah, I mean, we can all hope, and we all grew up in that very hopeful time, and it was nice to hang on to it. But, in the end, I come from Canada, and the amount that we were spending on defense and I was in the Defense Department when I started my career, was so low for so long that we weren't even just maintaining our very low level of military capability. We were rusting out. And frankly, until Mark Carney became prime minister, and you're all very familiar with him, we were rusting out. We were going backwards. The UK wasn't quite there, nor France, but many NATO countries were going backwards. So, we all wanted to take the peace dividend and invest in schools and healthcare, but what our Secretary General always says is, if you don't have peace, you don't have any of those things. And right now we need defense.
James, where is the biggest threat coming from currently, in your view?
I think if you're living in Europe, it's very clear, and I include the UK in Europe in the broader sense. We have a generational Russia problem. President Putin and the Kremlin have closed off the Russian information space for many, many years, and they are indoctrinating the Russian people to think that the West, the collective West, as they call us, is anti-Russian, which is not true, wants to prevent Russia from expanding. That is true. They have a full war economy. Their army is battle-hardened now. And they are very, very open about their ambitions, which is to retake control of lands which they consider to be theirs outside of their borders. If there's one major geopolitical threat for those of us living here, it's that.
Yeah, and that is very clear. That is not just an assertion or rhetoric. Russia has that explicit aim, which, to begin with, strikes fear into Baltic countries. You can understand why they've increased their defence spending. You can understand why they are reticent to provide troops to a peacekeeping force in Ukraine or beyond because of that very real, very immediate threat. I wonder, in the scope of what you do, what the threat looks like. Let's just explain. Of course, there is a military threat here, but we should also talk about the grey space as well. What might precede, or what is already happening now, before any military threat beyond Ukraine?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you raised that. And I think what's really important to understand about Russian, we call strategic doctrine, what they think in terms of strategy. It's not about the end state being military victory. The end state is political victory. And that means using all the instruments of state power, cyber, political interference, energy cutoffs, intelligence operations, military pressure to achieve political victory. So what does that mean for us? It means all kinds of, as you say, quite rightly, gray zone activities just below the threshold that would trigger Article 5 in NATO, so the collective defense commitment, but which put all kinds of pressure on political systems, on populations, which try to change the way we look at things using cognitive warfare.
Yeah.
And also to prepare the ground for real war.
Give us a few examples, James, if you can, as you're talking about this, and our listeners are trying to understand, what are we talking about here? Give us some examples if you can.
So I'll give you a few examples. For example, the damage that has been taking place to undersea data cables and energy pipelines carrying oil and gas in the Baltic Sea. So that has been going up very substantially over the last 5 years. And then we, NATO, put gray ships and drones out to sea in the Baltic, and suddenly it went to almost zero. And now it's come up a little bit again. Or, for example, assassinations or threats of assassinations. And, the UK has experienced that here, and the Skripal was a famous case of that. But in industry leaders who head up big defense firms are now under threat. Cyber attacks, which take place against all of our hospitals and energy infrastructure, and of course, political interference into our political systems, including information campaigns, funding political parties. So they are attempting just below the threshold to create disquiet and to prepare the ground if they ever had to go to a higher level.
Because this is often the precursor. This is much cheaper for Russia to exert. It falls below the threshold for Article 5, so they can do as much as they want of it, really, without any significant action. from a NATO nation or from a nation. Have you ever considered, or has there been conversations about how actually some of this should be brought into Article 5, that we should treat as seriously the cutting of undersea cables, a cyber attack, misinformation for political gain, actually whether that is on a par with a military attack? It should come under Article 5.
So we explicitly say that hybrid attacks can reach a threshold which could lead to a country and NATO invoking Article 5. We say the same thing about cyber attacks. The question is where that threshold is, and we don't want to define it. We don't want to define it because it's a political decision, and also because if you set a red line, then Russia will come right up below that red line. So we want to leave some ambiguity because that's good for deterrence. We also want to build up better resilience, and we're doing that across the board, including working much more closely with companies. And we want to deter by a little bit of punishment. And that includes, for example, steps we've taken, ejecting hundreds of Russian so-called diplomats who were intelligence operatives from our countries, or imposing sanctions. So there are ways in which we can push on the pain points to make it clear that some things are unacceptable.
Yeah, but I wonder how effective that is or will continue to be. You say that ambiguity is a good deterrence. Well, often it isn't, because Russia will keep on exerting until they can't. And if they don't know where the red line is, then they'll never learn. They'll just carry on doing it. Let me ask you about the USA in all of this. Is it a friend or a foe to NATO?
I mean, the US is a principal member of NATO. I've been in NATO a long, long time, and we've had a lot of ups and downs with U.S. administrations over the years. But in the end, the U.S. is the absolute foundation of NATO's military capability. It's by far the biggest contributor. The U.S. still has tens and tens of thousands of troops in Europe defending European countries. The chief military commander for NATO is a U.S. general who was just reappointed by the Trump administration. Our exercises are continuing, et cetera, et cetera. So, the U.S. remains a main stakeholder in NATO.
Are you worried about some of their actions, seizing the Venezuelan leader, blowing up boats in the Caribbean, holding serious discussions about ways that they can acquire Greenland, which, of course, is a territory of Denmark, is a NATO country? Surely that has to concern you.
Well, I think for me, and I speak personally, what is of most concern right now from a NATO point of view is the question of Greenland. It has obviously created tension between allies. I understand that Secretary Rubio is going to be calling Copenhagen in the coming days or week to discuss next steps. My own view is there are clearly legitimate security concerns with regard to security in the Arctic and security in Greenland. I know.
So even though the Danes say, actually, we've spent £8 billion on making it secure, we believe it's secure enough, from your perspective, there are legitimate security concerns.
Well, I think the Danes, first of all, do acknowledge that there are legitimate security concerns. And from what I can understand from Denmark's position, they're quite open to a substantial enhancement of the U.S. military presence on Greenland. So there's a lot of scope for discussion. I think a shared view that both China and Russia are expanding their position in the Arctic. That's very clear, in particular in the case of the Russians that are building out military capability, including opening old nuclear bases at a very rapid pace. And global warming is enhancing this destabilization in the region. So, I mean, there is a lot of legitimate discussions to be had about security in the region and how to enhance it. We definitely would like to see these two allies work it out together.
Yeah. But you must be worried. I mean, here we have a top aide to Donald Trump saying we have the right to take Greenland. We then later on that evening, a couple of nights ago, have a statement from the White House saying we are looking at different ways. We are seriously considering different ways in which we can acquire Greenland. And I think we can put our hands over our ears and shout, la, la, la. But the language here surely has to be a concern. Even if you think the end game is not, the leading member of NATO, the country that has the biggest military power in the world, is the biggest contributor to NATO, is saying, we think we can take that. We think we can have that. That surely has to be on an agenda somewhere in terms of concerns, risks.
Oh, I would not deny that it's a concern. And if you look at the statements released by a number of the United States' allies in NATO over the last few days, precisely in response to all those statements that you just quite rightly cited, they're really concerned. And I know that the Secretary General is working actively on this issue as well. Hopefully, NATO can provide a good platform for allies to discuss. Maybe it can play a role in providing ways forward, but that's for our political leaders to work out. But is there concern? Sure, and we've seen it in the statements by many, many leaders across Europe.
Is there a situation where the US and Russia work together?
I don't know if you're referring to a specific case. I'll just say this. I have been at NATO, for quite a long time. And when I was working more in a diplomatic role, as opposed to the more technology-oriented role I'm in now, we worked closely with the Russians. And I personally was quite responsible on that file. We had troops deployed together in the Balkans. We had joint counterterrorism information sharing for if planes were hijacked. We had joint counter-narcotics programs running right across Central Asia and into the Caucasus and around Afghanistan. Cooperation with Russia is something NATO would like. It's just cooperation with a Russia that is not invading its neighbors, that abides by international law, and a Russia in which we can trust. If we have that, every NATO country, without exception, would like a good relationship with Russia. The problem is Russia doesn't want it with us.
Yeah, you've spoken before about a face-to-face meeting that you had with Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin in 2009. What did Putin say to you?
Well, so let me just stress, because I didn't actually say that word that was in the article. The Secretary General met with President Putin. I was sitting next to the Secretary General. Let it be clear. He doesn't meet with me. But he walked in, President Putin. It was at that long white table, but happily we were on the short sides, not the COVID distances. And he sat down and said to Secretary General Rasmussen as his opening line, I intend for NATO to disappear. And the Secretary General immediately responded, that's unfortunate because I intend to make NATO stronger. And this was the beginning of a very fun and long meeting. And I've had a couple of meetings in which I participated where President Putin also, was there. He's very clear, he's very direct. And I think the key point to remember, when I was in school, they taught me that to understand Russia was an enigma wrapped in a puzzle, wrapped in a riddle. But that hasn't been my experience at all in 27 years as a diplomat. The Russians say exactly what they intend. They say it all the time. They put it into policy. They practice it. And then they do it, and we're surprised. So we should take them at face value because their ambitions are very clear.
Can I just focus on the UK to finish up with? You've issued a stark warning in the past. We are dealing with a Russia that is military focused, determined on expanding further into Europe. I wonder, from a UK focus, are we awake to that? We say we're going to increase defence spending. That's not happening quickly enough. We say we've got troops to send to Ukraine. It turns out we've got fewer than 7,500, and that may make our own domestic force vulnerable. We are billions of pounds short, we understand, from being anywhere near a wartime footing, really ready for any serious consideration of war. What is your warning to the UK? How do we need to approach this?
I'd say three things. One is, 5 years ago, I would have been deeply, deeply concerned because there wasn't even the recognition of how quickly we need to move. Second point is, I think now, from my perspective, the UK gets it. from a government point of view. The policies are changing, the money's being put there. So I think we're quite encouraged by the direction of travel here. But my concern is two things. One is, as you quite rightly pointed out, the money is not yet flowing fast enough to defense industry. And I just got off a discussion an hour ago, which really confirmed that. So that needs to move a little bit faster in all of our countries. But the second thing that concerns me is when there is a cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, there will be many people who come out and say, aha, now there's peace. Now we don't need to spend on defense. We can put money back to other very worthy causes. This is a moment of real risk, and it will be a discussion encouraged by the Russians behind the scenes. We need to keep our foot on the gas. We do not have the capabilities we need, and there is a real risk of war. We have heard that from our intelligence chiefs, from our political leaders across Europe, and we need to be strong so that there isn't war. The best deterrent will be that we are capable. And I can tell you, anything we spend on defense to build up our capabilities will be a lot less than we have to spend if hostilities break out. So this is a good investment.
Yeah. Can you give any more detail on that conversation that you've just had about money not flowing fast enough into the defense industry?
Well, you know, what you're hearing, and this is said publicly in many cases, heads of big defense prime contractors are continually raising the alarm that on the one hand, they recognize that NATO countries have taken the decisions to increase defense budgets. But what they're concerned about is the money actually flowing and contracts actually being signed because it's on that basis that they build. Now, the Secretary General of NATO has also said to these companies, look, guys, you're going to have to invest a little bit in advance. You know the money's coming. You know the requirements are there. We've made it very clear. And the decisions have been taken. So maybe you need to get a little bit ahead of the ball and start investing now. And then as the money taps start to open, it will flow to you, and you know it will flow to you. This is a little bit how the scale-ups and the startups, like, you know, the Palantirs and the Andurils, the Helsings, they work like that. They spend their own money, and then they go to government. Defense contractors kind of wait for the money to come. And the Secretary General said, look, maybe you need to move a little bit faster. So there is that as well. But we're in this period where the taps haven't fully opened and the contracts aren't fully signed. In most NATO countries, I think Germany is doing a little bit better than others. We need to.
How is the UK doing? Are we on a par with France and similar nations?
Yeah, I would say so. And I mean, I think the UK is right at the front. I mean, the UK gets it. It's true that the UK gets it. Has taken good decisions. Has allocated good money. The former.
Go on. Sorry.
I was just going to say that the defense review led by George Robertson is a solid piece of work, and it's being implemented now. So we're at that crucial point. We're just not quite yet at the taps fully being opened.